My sister looked me in the eye and said, "You're fine." She just admitted to opening 7 credit cards in my name. $59,000. My father stood behind her with his arms crossed, and my mother wouldn't look at me at all. I wish I could say it started there, in my parents' living room with my sister telling me I was fine while my credit lay in ruins. But it didn't. It started weeks earlier, on an ordinary morning when I was heading into my shift as a unit medic at Fort Cavazos. It was the kind of morning that felt completely unremarkable at the time. One of those days where everything moves in familiar patterns, where you're not expecting anything unusual. I was walking through the barracks hallway with my bag slung over one shoulder, already mentally running through the day schedule. Who would be at sick call? What supplies we needed to reorder? Whether I'd have time to grab lunch or if it would be another protein bar eaten standing up. 2 privates passed me going the opposite direction. They nodded quick greetings. I nodded back. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady buzz overhead. Someone's radio played faintly from one of the rooms, classic rock bleeding through a partially open door. A cleaning crew was working their way down the opposite corridor. Standard Tuesday morning. The kind of morning that blends into all the other mornings until something happens to mark it as different. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. I almost ignored it. I was 10 minutes from needing to be at the aid station, and I figured whatever it was could wait. But something made me pull it out anyway. Maybe instinct. Maybe just habit. Credit alert. Significant change detected. The words didn't register at first. I read them twice, 3 times, trying to process what they meant. My heart started beating faster. I stopped walking right there in the middle of the hallway and tapped the notification. The screen loaded. My credit score stared back at me. 760. That's what it had been 3 months ago when I checked it last. I remembered that number exactly because I'd been proud of it, the way you're proud of something you've worked hard to build. But the number on my screen now made my vision blur at the edges. 438. Over 300 points, just gone. My hands started shaking. I must have stood there for a full minute, trying to make the math make sense, trying to find some explanation that didn't mean what I thought it meant. But numbers don't lie. I pulled the full credit report right there in the hallway, my thumb scrolling faster and faster as the truth assembled itself line by line. Multiple unfamiliar credit cards, names of banks I'd never walked into, accounts I'd never opened, every single one maxed out to the limit, missed payments going back months, late fees stacking on top of late fees like some kind of financial avalanche. I added up the balances in my head. $59,214. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I called the first bank on the list. My voice sounded strange when the representative answered, "Too high and tight." I explained that I was looking at a credit card on my report that I didn't recognize, that I'd never applied for an account with them. The woman on the other end asked for my social security number, my date of birth, my address. There was a pause while she pulled up the account. "Yes, ma'am, I see that account here. It was opened approximately 14 months ago." I didn't open it. The application was submitted with your social security number and date of birth. The billing address is listed as. She read off my parents' address. My stomach dropped. "That's not my address. It's the address on file for the account, ma'am." I thanked her and ended the call. Then I just stood there in that hallway staring at my phone, at that address, at the reality of what it meant. It wasn't a random thief. It wasn't some stranger who'd stolen my information. The billing address was my parents' house. Someone in my family had done this. I needed air. I pushed through the nearest exit and stepped out into the Texas heat. It hit me like a wall, but I barely felt it. My mind was already racing ahead to the question I didn't want to ask, the answer I didn't want to hear. I dialed my father's number. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Hey, sweetheart." I couldn't get the words out at first. My throat felt like it was closing. I stood there in the sun, with sweat starting to bead on my forehead, and I tried to make my mouth form the question. "Dad," my voice cracked. "Did Megan open credit cards in my name?" The pause that followed told me everything. It stretched out long and heavy, and in that silence I could hear him thinking, calculating, deciding what to say. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He wasn't asking me what I was talking about or telling me that was impossible. He was just quiet. Finally, he spoke. His voice was careful, measured. "Come home this weekend. We'll talk about it." I kept my voice as level as I could manage, even as everything inside me was falling apart. I chose to listen first, to let him speak, to not jump to accusations before I understood the full picture. But his answer had already told me what I needed to know. He hadn't said no. He hadn't said I was wrong. He'd just asked me to come home so we could talk about it. Which meant he knew. He'd known, and he hadn't told me. "Okay," I said. "I'll be there Saturday." I ended the call and stood there for a long time, phone still in my hand, staring at nothing. A vehicle drove past. Someone called out a greeting from across the parking area. The world kept moving, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I drove nearly 3 hours that Saturday. Left base around 9 in the morning, early enough that the highway wasn't too crowded yet, but late enough that the sun was already brutal. The Texas landscape stretched out on both sides, flat and endless, broken up by the occasional gas station or cluster of fast food restaurants at an exit. My thoughts kept circling, the same questions over and over, like a record stuck on a scratch. How long had this been happening? How many times had Megan used my information before this? How much did my parents know? Had they been helping her? Had they been covering for her this whole time while I thought everything was fine? The worst part was remembering all the times in the past year when Megan had mentioned needing money. When she complained about her car payment or her rent. When she'd made comments about how lucky I was to have steady income and benefits, I thought she was just venting, just making conversation. I'd never imagined she was already stealing from me while saying those things. I tried calling my mother twice during the drive. Both times it went straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. Beige siding that needed washing, the porch railing where the paint was peeling, the frayed American flag still hanging from the bracket by the front door, the same one that had been there for years. Everything familiar, everything normal. But Megan's car was parked in the driveway, and it was newer than the last time I'd been home. A lot newer. I stared at it through my windshield, at the sleek paint and the updated model year, and something cold settled in my chest. That car hadn't been there last Christmas. It hadn't been there at Easter. But it was here now, sitting in the Texas sun like a silent receipt. I sat in my car with the engine off and the keys still in my hand, trying to brace myself for what was coming. Trying to prepare for the conversation I was about to walk into. A memory surfaced, uninvited. I was 10 years old, standing in this same driveway. I'd fallen off my bike, scraped my knee bad enough that blood was running down my shin. Megan had been watching from the porch, and when she saw it happen, she'd started crying. Not because she was hurt, but because she'd seen me get hurt. My father had come running out of the house. He'd knelt down right there on the driveway, but not in front of me, in front of Megan. He'd wrapped his arms around her and told her it was okay, that everything was fine, that she didn't need to be scared. And over her shoulder, while he was holding her, he'd looked at me standing there with blood dripping down my leg. "You're fine," he'd said to me, just like that, "you're fine." I'd nodded and wiped the blood off myself while he held her. Later, inside, I'd cleaned the wound alone in the bathroom while Megan sat at the kitchen table with a cookie, her tears already dried. I'd forgotten that day. Or I'd tried to. But sitting there in the driveway 20 years later, I remembered it perfectly. I got out of the car and walked to the door. Megan was sitting on the couch when I came in, scrolling through her phone with her thumb moving in quick, practiced flicks. She looked up the moment I stepped inside, too fast, like she'd been waiting for the sound of the door. She smiled, but it came and went in the space of a heartbeat, nervous and automatic. Then she set the phone face down on the cushion next to her and shifted her posture like she was settling in for something. My mother stood in the kitchen. Her hands moved over the counter, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. A dish towel, a stack of mail, the salt and pepper shakers. She didn't look at me. My father leaned in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, arms crossed over his chest. His posture was guarded, defensive, like he was already prepared for a fight. No one hugged me. No one stood up. No one said welcome home. I stayed standing. I set my bag down by the door and looked at each of them in turn. How long? I asked. Megan's eyes flicked sideways toward my father before she opened her mouth. She didn't answer. She just looked at him, waiting for permission or instruction or something I couldn't name. My father moved forward half a step. Let's all just calm down and... How long, Megan? I repeated, keeping my eyes on her. How long have you been opening credit cards in my name? She shifted on the couch. Her hands moved to her lap, fingers twisting together. I was going to tell you. I just needed time to... Time? I pulled out my phone and opened the credit report. The numbers glowed on the screen. 7 cards. $59,000. That's not needing time. That's destroying someone's credit. That's fraud. My mother looked away, turning her body toward the sink like she suddenly had something urgent to do there. And that's when I knew. She'd known all along. Maybe not the exact numbers, maybe not every detail, but she'd known. My father stepped fully into the room now. Megan's been struggling. She made a mistake, but she's family. We handle things as a family. Megan's voice came quieter now, almost pleading. I borrowed it. I was always planning to pay you back later. You're in the army. You have a steady paycheck. You have benefits. Health care. You're fine. There it was. That phrase again. The same words my father had said to me 20 years ago while I stood bleeding in the driveway. You're fine. My credit score dropped over 300 points, I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. I have 7 fraudulent accounts on my report. I have missed payments and late fees and maxed out balances on cards I didn't even know existed. My security clearance could be at risk. My career could be at risk. This isn't fine. My father's face hardened. His jaw set. You're being dramatic. This is a family matter. We don't call the police on family. I looked at each of them again. Really looked at them. My mother still wouldn't meet my eyes. Megan sat with her arms crossed now, defensive, like she was the one being wronged. My father stood between me and them like he was ready to physically block me if I moved the wrong direction. I took a breath. I chose self-control over escalation. I kept my voice steady and made my position clear. If Megan signs a repayment agreement, I said, if she agrees in writing to pay back what she took and to close all the accounts, I won't go to the police. Megan's response came so fast it overlapped with my last word. No. My father's voice was equally immediate. We're not signing anything legal. That's not how this family works. I felt something settle in my chest. A cold, clear certainty. Then, I'm filing a police report. Megan made a sound like a sob and dropped her face into her hands. My mother rushed to her immediately, crossing the room in quick steps and sinking onto the couch beside her. She wrapped one arm around Megan's shoulders and pulled her close, murmuring something I couldn't hear. My father's face turned red. The color rose from his neck to his cheeks, and his voice when he spoke was louder than before. You won't do that. I know you won't do that. I will. He took a step toward me. Not threatening, not exactly, but close enough that I had to tilt my head back slightly to maintain eye contact. He pointed toward the door. If you file that report, you don't come back here. You understand me? You're not welcome in this house. I looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my homework and driven me to the recruiter's office when I'd enlisted. This man who was now telling me that holding his other daughter accountable for stealing from me would make me unwelcome in my own family. I picked up my bag from where I'd set it by the door. I walked out without another word. I didn't slam the door. I didn't yell. I just left. 3 days later, I filed the police report. The station was small and quiet, just a few desks and a waiting area with plastic chairs. The officer who took my statement was in his 40s, professional and detached in the way that comes from years of hearing people's problems. He asked for my information. I gave it. He asked for documentation. I pulled out my phone and showed him the credit reports, the bank statements, the confirmation that the billing address was my parents' house. He typed it all into his computer with the steady rhythm of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Then he leaned back and looked at me. Identity theft cases involving family members are complicated, he said. They're not uncommon, but they're complicated. You sure you want to proceed with this? Yes. He nodded. You'll be contacted by a detective within the week. They'll want to interview you, get more documentation, maybe talk to the banks directly. This is going to take time, could be months before anything happens. I thanked him and left. I sat in my car in the parking lot and stared at the receipt he'd given me, case number printed across the top. My name, today's date. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life happen. My phone buzzed. A text from my father. You've made your choice. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove back to base. The detective called 4 days later. Her name was Hayes. She had a direct, no-nonsense voice that I appreciated immediately. She asked if I was sure I wanted to proceed, given that the suspect was my sister. I told her yes. She said she understood that she'd begin the investigation and that I should prepare for this to take time, possibly a lot of time. I said I understood. She promised to keep me updated. 2 weeks went by. I tried to focus on work, on my routine, on the things I could control, but my phone became a source of anxiety. Every notification made my heart jump. Every unknown number made my stomach tighten. Then I got called into my commander's office. I walked in expecting a routine check-in, maybe something about upcoming training or a schedule change. Instead, she closed the door behind me and asked me to sit. Her expression was carefully neutral. I received a complaint, she said. Your father contacted the base. He claims you're making false accusations against your family and that it's affecting your judgment and your ability to perform your duties. My stomach turned over. The air in the office felt suddenly thin. He contacted the base? She nodded. He did. I need to hear your side of this. I explained everything, the credit alert, the debt, the police report, the address that linked everything to my parents' house, the refusal to make any kind of restitution, the threat when I said I'd file the report. I kept my voice level and stuck to the facts, but my hands were shaking in my lap. She listened without interrupting. Her expression stayed neutral, professional. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned back in her chair. Do you have documentation of what you're telling me? I pulled it up on my phone. Credit reports showing the fraudulent accounts. Bank confirmations with my parents' address. The police report number and the detective contact information. I handed her my phone and watched her scroll through it all slowly, carefully. When she looked up, something in her expression had shifted. You did the right thing. This is fraud, and you're handling it through the appropriate channels. Your father's complaint is noted in your file, but it doesn't change the facts of the situation. Keep me updated if this escalates any further, but as far as I'm concerned, you've conducted yourself properly. The relief that washed over me was so intense, I felt dizzy. Thank you. She handed my phone back. For what it's worth, I think it takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing. I left her office and went back to work, but the weight didn't lift completely, because now I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. My father hadn't just chosen Megan over me, he'd actively tried to use my chain of command against me. He tried to damage my career, my reputation, my standing with my unit. He'd weaponized the institution I worked for to try to force me into backing down. The betrayal was complete. A month later, Detective Hayes called again. She completed the preliminary investigation and she wanted to walk me through what she'd found. The evidence, she said, was clear and extensive. 7 credit cards had been opened using my social security number, my date of birth, and my mother's maiden name as the answer to security questions. The billing address on every single account was my parents' house. No variation, no typos. The exact same address used consistently across all 7 applications. She'd obtained security footage from one of the bank branches. The timestamp showed Megan walking up to a desk, sitting down with a bank representative, filling out forms. The footage was grainy but clear enough to show her handing over documents, clear enough to see her signing paperwork. Hayes had also pulled phone records, multiple calls from my parents' house to various credit card companies in the months before and after accounts were opened. She'd documented the purchase patterns too: high-end electronics, clothing, restaurants, car payments, not the kind of spending that suggested someone in crisis. The kind of spending that suggested someone living beyond their means and using someone else's credit to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford. The evidence is strong, Hayes said, more than strong enough to proceed with charges. But I need to know if you want to press charges. This is your decision. I sat on my bed in my barracks room with the phone pressed to my ear. Outside, someone was playing music. A door slammed down the hall. Normal evening sounds. Yes, I said. I want to press charges. Understood. I'll forward this to the prosecutor's office. You'll be contacted about the arraignment date. The arraignment was scheduled for 6 weeks later. I didn't tell my parents I was coming. Part of me worried they'd try to stop me somehow. Another part just didn't want to deal with more conflict before I even got there. I drove to the courthouse on the appointed day. It was a Tuesday morning, overcast and cool for Texas. The courthouse was an older building, limestone and brick, with a parking lot that had seen better days. I found a spot in the back and sat in my car for 10 minutes, gathering my nerve. When I finally walked inside, the security line moved slowly. People ahead of me emptied pockets, removed belts, stepped through metal detectors with the weary familiarity of those who'd done this before. I'd never been in a courthouse for anything other than traffic court once when I was 19. This felt different, heavier. I found the courtroom and slipped into the back row, trying to make myself small and invisible. The room smelled like old wood and floor polish. The benches were hard. A clock on the wall ticked audibly in the quiet. Megan appeared 10 minutes later with a public defender at her side. The defender was a woman in her 50s, tired-looking, wearing a gray suit that had been pressed but still somehow looked rumpled. She carried a briefcase that bulged with files, its leather scuffed and worn at the corners. Megan wore a navy dress I'd never seen before, conservative, knee-length, the kind of thing you'd wear to a job interview or a funeral. She kept her eyes down as she walked to the defense table, kept her hands folded in front of her. She didn't look around the courtroom, didn't acknowledge anyone. The judge entered and we all stood. She was younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with dark hair pulled back severe and tight. She sat and we sat and the clerk called the case number. The judge read the charges in a voice that echoed slightly in the courtroom. 7 counts of identity theft, multiple counts of credit card fraud. Total amount exceeded $59,000. The words hung in the air like smoke, solid and visible and undeniable. Megan entered a plea of not guilty. Her voice was so quiet the judge had to lean forward. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Can you speak up, please?" "Not guilty." Louder this time, but barely. Bail was set at $10,000. The judge's voice was matter-of-fact, like she'd said those words 1,000 times before with 1,000 different amounts. I watched my father stand from his seat 3 rows ahead of me. He walked to the clerk's window with his back straight and his shoulders set. He posted the bail immediately. Cash. counted out $100 bills like it was nothing, like $10,000 was loose change he happened to have in his wallet. I wondered where he'd gotten it, wondered if he'd withdrawn it that morning or if he'd had it ready for weeks, preparing for this moment. As I stood to leave, I found my mother waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom. She looked smaller than I remembered, like she'd shrunk into herself. Her eyes were red, her voice shook when she spoke. "You didn't have to do this." I stopped, looked at her. She stole from me. She destroyed my credit. She put my career at risk. What did you want me to do? "She's your sister." "And I'm her sister." That didn't stop her. My mother's face crumpled. Her voice rose slightly, taking on an edge of desperation. "You're tearing this family apart." Something hardened in my chest, a clarity I hadn't felt before. I didn't tear it apart. I just stopped pretending it wasn't already broken. She didn't say anything else. I walked past her and kept walking, out of the courthouse, across the parking lot, into my car. I didn't look back. The preliminary hearing happened 2 months later. The courtroom was fuller this time. I sat alone on one side. My parents sat on the other, flanking Megan like bodyguards. The prosecutor presented the evidence systematically. Credit reports, bank records, security footage showing Megan at the bank, address confirmations, the social security number usage, everything laid out in careful, damning detail. Megan's attorney argued that this was a family dispute, not a criminal matter, that I was using the legal system for retaliation over some unrelated family conflict, that sisters have disagreements, and this was a gross overreach of the criminal justice system. The judge wasn't swayed. Probable cause was clearly established. The case would proceed to trial unless a plea agreement was reached. That's when my father took the stand. He was called as a character witness for Megan. I watched him walk to the witness box, raise his right hand, swear to tell the truth. Then he sat down and looked straight at the prosecutor without even glancing in my direction. He testified that I'd always been jealous of Megan, that I'd been difficult and uncooperative since joining the Army, that I resented the family for not supporting my career choice the way I'd wanted, that this prosecution was my way of punishing them, of lashing out, of trying to hurt Megan because I'd always felt like she got more attention. None of it was true, but he said it under oath in open court, with Megan sitting right there nodding along like it was the most accurate description she'd ever heard. My mother went next. She claimed I'd given Megan permission to use my information for a temporary loan. She said it had been verbal, casual, the kind of thing families do for each other. She said I was going back on my word now, out of spite. The prosecutor asked if she had any documentation of this agreement, any text messages, any emails, anything in writing. She shook her head. No, it had been verbal, just a conversation between sisters. The prosecutor asked when this conversation had allegedly taken place. My mother hesitated. "I'm not sure of the exact date." The prosecutor pulled up the timeline. The first fraudulent account had been opened 14 months ago. Was it before or after that first account was opened? Another hesitation. "I think before." "You think?" "It was before." "So your daughter gave permission for her sister to use her identity over a year ago?" "Yes." "And then forgot about it?" "I don't know what she remembered or didn't remember." "But you remembered this conversation clearly enough to testify about it under oath." My mother's voice got quieter. "Yes." I sat there listening to my parents lie and felt something inside me go cold and completely still. This wasn't just denial. This wasn't just family protecting family. This was active, intentional distortion of reality. They were willing to commit perjury to protect Megan. They were willing to destroy my credibility, my character, my truth, to avoid holding her accountable. I steadied my breathing, chose restraint. I wouldn't trade truth for vengeance. I would let the evidence speak for itself. When it was my turn to testify, the prosecutor walked me through everything: the credit alert, the ruined score, the fraudulent accounts, The phone call to my father, the confrontation at the house, the refusal to sign a repayment agreement, the threat when I said I'd file a police report. I answered every question calmly and directly. I presented the bank confirmations, the police report, the complete timeline. The defense attorney tried to paint me as vindictive during cross-examination, tried to suggest I was exaggerating the financial damage, tried to imply I was using this situation to get attention or money or revenge. But the numbers didn't lie. $59,000. 7 cards. My social security number. Their address. Multiple missed payments. A credit score that had dropped from 760 to 438. A career that required a security clearance now potentially at risk because of financial issues that weren't even mine. The hearing ended with the judge ruling that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. 3 weeks later, Megan's attorney contacted the prosecutor with a proposal. Megan wanted to negotiate a plea deal. The prosecutor called me on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of inventory at the aid station, counting bandages and checking expiration dates on medications. I stepped outside to take the call. The offer was straightforward. Megan would plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for probation, restitution, and mandatory counseling. The plea would include a felony conviction on her record. She'd avoid jail time, but there would be consequences. Real, documented, permanent consequences. The alternative, the prosecutor explained, was going to trial, which could take another 6 months, maybe longer, which would mean more testimony, more public exposure, more opportunities for my parents to lie on the stand, more newspaper articles, because local papers loved covering identity theft cases involving family members, more people knowing my business, more explaining. I told the prosecutor I needed time to think about it. I thought about it for 2 days. Couldn't think about much else, really. Turned it over and over in my mind like a stone I was trying to see from every angle. A trial would mean vindication in one sense. A jury hearing all the evidence and rendering a verdict. The satisfaction of a complete public airing of what happened. But it would also mean months more of this. Months more of my life being consumed by court dates and legal proceedings. Months more of carrying this weight. A plea would mean acknowledgement. It would mean Megan admitting in a legal proceeding in front of a judge that she'd committed a crime against me. It would mean she couldn't later claim it was a misunderstanding or a family dispute or something I'd blown out of proportion. It would be in the record. Permanent. True. It would mean restitution. Actual money, however slowly it came, being paid back, the debt being acknowledged officially, and it would mean I could start to move on, start to rebuild, start to focus on something other than this case. I called the prosecutor back on Saturday morning, told her I'd accept the plea agreement. The plea hearing was scheduled for a month later. I arrived at the courthouse early and sat in the front row this time, not hiding in the back, not trying to make myself invisible. I'd done nothing wrong, and I wasn't going to act like I had. Megan entered with her attorney. They sat at the defense table. Megan didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. The judge reviewed the terms of the plea agreement in detail. Megan would plead guilty to 1 count of identity theft and 1 count of credit card fraud. She would be sentenced to 3 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, mandatory financial counseling, and full restitution of $59,214. The conviction would remain on her record as a felony. The judge asked Megan if she understood the terms. Yes, Megan said. The judge asked if she was pleading guilty because she was, in fact, guilty of the charges. There was a pause, long enough that I could hear someone cough in the back of the courtroom. Then Megan's voice, barely audible. Yes. The judge accepted the plea. Sentencing would be scheduled separately. As we filed out of the courtroom, my father caught up with me in the hallway. He looked older than he had at the arraignment. Tired. Lines around his eyes that I didn't remember seeing before. You didn't have to take it this far, he said. I stopped and turned to face him fully. I gave her a chance. I offered a repayment plan. You told me to leave. She's still your sister. And I'm still a person. I'm still someone who deserves not to be stolen from. He shook his head slowly. You could have handled this privately. Within the family. I tried. You shut the door. We stood there for a long moment. People moved past us in the hallway. Voices echoed. Someone's phone rang. The normal sounds of the courthouse on a Thursday afternoon. He didn't apologize. Didn't take back anything he'd said in court. Didn't admit that he lied. He just looked at me like I was someone he didn't quite recognize anymore, and then he walked away. I drove back to base and sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. My hands were shaking. My chest felt tight. But underneath all of that was something else. Something quieter. A sense that I'd done what I needed to do. My phone buzzed. A text from a friend asking if I wanted to grab dinner. Something normal. Something that had nothing to do with courtrooms or families or betrayal. I replied yes and put the phone down. Life continued. 2 weeks after the plea hearing, the formal sentencing date was set. My commander called me into her office again, and for a moment I felt that same spike of anxiety I'd felt the first time, but her expression was different this time. Less guarded. She told me that another complaint had been filed by my father. He'd alleged that I was using military resources to pursue a personal vendetta, that I was distracted and unreliable, that my judgment was compromised. She asked for an updated account of the situation. I walked her through the plea agreement, the terms of restitution, the fact that Megan had admitted guilt in a court of law. She listened, took notes. Then she looked up at me with something that might have been respect. This complaint is baseless, she said. You've conducted yourself with integrity throughout this entire process. I'm documenting that assessment and closing the complaint. It won't affect your record. I thanked her. She nodded and then added, For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. It takes real courage to hold family accountable when they don't want to be held accountable. Her words stayed with me long after I left her office. A week before the sentencing hearing, my father called. The phone rang while I was grocery shopping. I saw his name on the screen and almost declined it. Stood there in the cereal aisle staring at my phone while it rang. An older woman with a cart gave me an odd look as she passed. I answered on the fourth ring. I need to talk to you, he said. No greeting, no small talk, no, how are you doing? Okay, not over the phone. Can you meet me somewhere? Neutral territory. The phrase struck me as odd, like we were negotiating a peace treaty between hostile nations rather than father and daughter trying to have a conversation. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop halfway between the base and my parents' house. Gave him a time, hung up, stood there in the grocery store feeling strange and unmoored. I arrived at the coffee shop first. It was one of those local places that tries to have character, with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls and chalkboard menus. I ordered a coffee I didn't really want, just to have something to do with my hands, and sat down by the window where I could see the parking lot. He arrived 10 minutes later in his truck. I watched him park, watched him sit there for a moment before getting out, watched him walk toward the door with his shoulders set in that way he had when he was bracing for something difficult. He looked older. The thought came to me unbidden as he walked in, more gray in his hair than I remembered. Lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, or maybe I just hadn't noticed them. He ordered his own coffee and sat down across from me, set his cup on the table between us like we were establishing a demilitarized zone. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We just sat there in this aggressively quirky coffee shop with indie music playing overhead and the hiss of the espresso machine in the background. Finally, he cleared his throat, looked down at his coffee, started talking without meeting my eyes. I didn't think it would go this far. I waited. I thought you'd drop it. I thought you'd let it go. I thought once you'd made your point, once we all knew you were serious, you'd back down and we could work something out privately. Why would I do that? He looked down at his coffee. Because that's what you always did. You were the easy one. You didn't make trouble. You went along with things. You let things go. I felt the old anger rise up in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. Being easy doesn't mean being a doormat. He nodded slowly, like he was working through something he didn't want to accept. Your mother's not doing well. Is she ready to admit what Megan did was wrong? He hesitated. She thinks you're being too hard on her. I'm not being too hard on her. The law is. I'm just not covering for her anymore. He nodded slowly, like he was processing something he didn't want to accept. I should have stood with you in court. I met his eyes. Yes, you should have. He didn't apologize, didn't say he regretted what he'd testified, didn't take back the lies he'd told under oath. But he sat there with that admission hanging between us, and for the first time I saw something that might have been shame in his expression. We sat in silence for a few more minutes. Then I stood up. I won't be sacrificed to keep the peace, I said. When Mom's ready to actually talk about what happened, when she's ready to admit what Megan did was wrong, she can call me. But I'm not pretending anymore. I'm not going to be the one who absorbs everyone else's damage just so the family can look functional. He nodded, didn't try to argue, didn't try to convince me to reconsider. I left without hugging him. 2 months after the plea agreement was finalized, the first restitution check arrived in the mail. $412. I stood in my kitchen holding the envelope, staring at the check inside. $412 against a debt of $59,214. It would take years at this rate, maybe a decade, but that wasn't the point. I deposited it and watched the account balance change by an amount that barely registered financially. But it wasn't about the money, it was about the shift. About the fact that for the first time since this whole thing started, the burden wasn't mine alone. Someone else was paying. Someone else was being held responsible. That night, I slept through until morning for the first time in months. Sentencing day came in early November. The courtroom was different this time. Quieter, smaller, no character witnesses, no dramatic testimony, just the formal pronouncement of consequences. I arrived early. The courthouse was cold, the air outside sharp and clean. I walked around the building for a few minutes, breathing it in, trying to steady myself for whatever was about to happen. Megan appeared different that day, smaller. She wore the same navy dress she'd worn to the arraignment, but it seemed to hang on her differently now. She said very little, kept her head down, avoided eye contact with everyone, including her attorney. My parents arrived together. I watched them walk in, watched them look around the courtroom, watched them choose where to sit. They didn't sit behind Megan this time, didn't sit in the front row to show support. They sat farther back, several rows behind the defense table, with a visible gap between them and where Megan sat. My mother stared down at her hands the entire time. My father watched the judge with an expression I couldn't quite read. The judge reviewed the plea agreement one final time and pronounced the sentence: 3 years probation, 200 hours of community service, mandatory financial counseling, full restitution of $59,214, felony conviction on record. Megan stood and accepted the terms in that same quiet voice she'd used at the plea hearing. The judge asked if she understood. She said yes. The judge dismissed the court. People began to file out. I gathered my things slowly, taking my time. As I reached the hallway, my father appeared beside me. "You got what you wanted," he said. I looked at him steadily. "I got what was right. There's a difference." He opened his mouth like he was going to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He turned and walked away down the corridor. That was the last time I saw my mother in person. Life after sentencing looked different in ways that were both obvious and subtle. I focused on the practical work of rebuilding. My credit score began to inch upward as the fraudulent accounts were closed and explanatory notes were added to my file. The process was slow. Each month, the number would tick up by 5 points, maybe 10 if I was lucky. but he was moving in the right direction. My commander called me in one more time about a month after sentencing. She told me that I'd handled the situation the right way from start to finish, that it had taken integrity to see it through when my family was pressuring me to back down, that she wanted me to know my conduct had been exemplary throughout. Her validation mattered more than I expected it to, more than I wanted to admit. I started therapy shortly after that. I hadn't planned to, hadn't really thought I needed it. But one day I woke up and realized I was carrying all of this alone, processing it alone, trying to make sense of it alone, and I needed a place where I could talk about it without judgment or agenda. My therapist helped me understand that forgiveness didn't mean erasing boundaries. It meant releasing the need for revenge while still doing the next right thing. Romans 12:19 kept coming back to me in those sessions. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. I wasn't trying to destroy anyone. I wasn't trying to punish Megan out of malice. I was just refusing to be destroyed myself. The restitution payments continued. They came like clockwork, arriving on the same day each month. Small amounts, never enough to make a real dent in the total. But the meaning wasn't in the money. It was in the acknowledgement, in the fact that someone was finally, officially paying for what had been taken. Months passed, seasons changed. I fell into new routines, started running in the mornings before shift, took up cooking actual meals instead of just eating whatever was fastest. Small things that added up to a life that felt more like mine. My father sent a single text one day in March. I hope you're doing well. I read it sitting on my couch with a cup of tea cooling on the table beside me. I thought about replying, thought about what I might say. Then I set the phone down and didn't reply at all. I started to notice other small signs of healing. I hummed while making dinner one evening and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done that. The silence in my apartment felt softer instead of heavy and oppressive. I stopped checking my credit report every day and moved to weekly checks, then monthly. The restitution kept arriving. Each deposit carried a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief that the debt was slowly being addressed. Grief that this was what my family relationship had become, a monthly payment and nothing else. Nearly a year after the sentencing, I ran into my father at a grocery store. I was visiting a friend who lived near my parents' old neighborhood and had stopped to pick up a few things. I was in the produce section, trying to decide between two types of apples, when I looked up and saw him standing by the citrus. We made eye contact at the same moment. For a second, I thought about turning around and leaving, finding a different store. But I was tired of running from awkward moments and uncomfortable encounters. He walked over slowly, like he was approaching something that might startle and bolt. I didn't think you'd ever come back to this area. I'm visiting someone. He nodded, shifted his weight, looked uncomfortable. Your mother asks about you sometimes. Does she? She does. He paused. I didn't raise you to turn on your family. I could have explained, could have walked him through the reasoning one more time, could have tried to make him understand that holding someone accountable isn't the same as turning on them. But I was tired of defending the truth to people who didn't want to see it. You raised me to tell the truth, I said. I stopped lying for everyone else. He looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been understanding or might have been resignation. He nodded once without apologizing, and we went our separate ways down different aisles. My mother never reached out. Not a text, not a call, not an email. I stopped waiting for it. I built a quieter life, moved into a small apartment closer to base, a place that felt like mine in a way the barracks never had. 1 bedroom, a kitchen with actual counter space, windows that faced east so I got morning light. I kept my medic discipline, the routines that grounded me. Early mornings, organized space, everything in its place. I learned to treat being the easy one as a warning sign instead of a virtue. When I found myself smoothing over conflict that wasn't mine, when I caught myself absorbing someone else's consequences to keep the peace, when I felt that old familiar pull to just let it go, to not make trouble, to be fine. I recognized it for what it was, and I chose differently. Sometimes I imagine what would have happened if I'd stayed quiet. I picture myself years down the line, still cleaning up messes that weren't mine, still absorbing damage to keep everyone else comfortable, still being told I was fine, while my credit stayed ruined and my name stayed compromised and my career hung in the balance. I imagined that version of myself, small and diminished, still playing the role of the easy one. Then I look around my calm apartment, at the life I've built on my own terms, at the boundaries I maintain without apology, at the peace that comes from knowing I chose truth over comfort, and I know I chose right. Accountability isn't cruelty, it's clarity. It's the refusal to participate in a shared delusion. It's the decision to call things what they actually are instead of what everyone wishes they were. And sometimes the people who demand your silence are the ones who benefit most from your compliance. They're the ones who need you to keep absorbing the damage so they don't have to deal with the mess they've made or enabled or ignored. I didn't break when I filed that police report. As James 1:19 says, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. I bent. I listened. I waited. I gave them every possible chance to make it right. And when waiting became enabling, when silence became complicity, I stood up. If you've ever been told you're tearing the family apart just because you stopped tearing yourself apart for them, I see you. If you've ever been called vindictive for refusing to be victimized quietly, I understand. If you've ever had to choose between your own well-being and your family's comfort, and you chose yourself, I want you to know something. You're not cruel, you're not selfish, you're not wrong. You're just done being the cost of someone else's peace.